Good morning, brothers and sisters in our Lord Jesus Christ from our family here in France. I'm pleased to be able to talk to you this morning a little bit about our life in France. As you know, we moved to France as a family so that we could enjoy the country life and the peace and quiet that we have here. And one of the things that, as a result of us living here in France, is that I spend a lot of time in the garden doing gardening and cutting of grass, and I get to think a lot about things. And sometimes perhaps you may think I'm starting to lose my mind or spending too much time thinking about things in the Exhort, but anyway, one of the things about gardening in France is that we have a lot of bramble and we have a lot of stinging nettles, and I normally have to, when I cut these down, I use a bush cutter, but I read a book when I was at school, and it was a book I really enjoyed. It was a book called The Day of the Triffids by a chap called John Wyndham. Now, in this book, triffids are these plants that have been developed genetically to be mobile, and they have a sting on them. And due to some traumatic event, all the people in the world go blind, and these triffids go around, and there's a battle between the blind human race and the triffids, and sort of now that they're on equal footing, and these triffids display intelligence and able to start sort of herding people. And I often think when I cut these stinging nettles and the bramble here, that the stinging nettles seem to have some form of intelligence, because even though I use a bush cutter to cut the stinging nettles, and the bush cutter gives me about a meter and a half's worth of length away from these stinging nettles, that they somehow manage to wreak some kind of revenge on me, because if I've got a gap between my glove and my sleeve, somehow the stinging nettles always seem to be able to fall between that gap as they fall, as I cut them. And bramble seems to be able to do the same thing. It hooks me, and I've still got thorns in my head from these bramble that seem to catch me as I try cut it down. So getting back to my story, it kind of gives a little bit of a background. Last Saturday was actually quite a pleasant day, and because we'd started off spring very nicely, but then we had the what they call the beast from the east that swept across Europe and caused our temperatures to plunge. But beast from the east not being anything from Revelation at all, but rather a cold wind that blows across from Siberia. And when this comes across, literally we dropped nearly 30 degrees in temperature. We were having days of 18 degrees, and then suddenly we started plunging to about -8 below. So last Saturday was a very pleasant day, and I stepped outside the door and I heard the birds singing. I said to Belinda, "Oh, we've got to spend some time in the garden." And I went round to the back area of the house, and we've got a rather large peach tree there, and I intended to cut this peach tree down, well, not cut the peach tree down, but to prune the peach tree last autumn, because autumn's supposedly the right time to prune fruit trees, and we probably have to check with June to make sure that I'm talking sense here. But anyway, I thought, well, seeing I'd got so busy last autumn that this would be an ideal time to prune this peach tree, because this peach tree was rather large. It hadn't been pruned for at least 10 years, and it was quite a splendid tree. And but the other thing about this peach tree is that it wasn't producing any fruit, so probably being the main objective of trying to prune it, because I actually said to Belinda that I needed to cut a large section of this tree down because it had just grown massive. So I got the chainsaw out, the secateurs, put on the gloves, the step ladder, and the face guard as well, and I put it next to the tree, and I climbed up this peach tree to start pruning the peach tree. But when I had a look at when I was up there, I suddenly started having second thoughts, because I looked at the beauty of this tree. It was a really magnificent tree, and it got to this time of year where all the buds had started coming out on the tree, because it was trying to put out its leaves so it could benefit from the full sunshine of summer. So I kind of hesitated, and I sort of climbed down the ladder again, and I had another look at this tree, and I thought, really, do I have to cut such a beautiful tree? And I thought, well, along what we're told, if Jesus tells us in Matthew 3 verse 10, the axe is at the root of the tree, and every tree that does not produce good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire. So based on that, I thought, well, if the tree is not producing fruit, I may as well prune this tree. So I climbed up the ladder again, and went and I cut the tree. I started pruning the tree, and I actually sort of chopped quite a lot of the branches out of this tree, because this tree had obviously been putting so much effort into developing these beautiful branches and these leaves and growing tall and strong, that it had no, all the nutrients that it was sucking up from the soil were going into the branches, and this full display and this glory of the tree, rather than there being anything left for developing fruit and producing good fruit. So I eventually cut these branches down, and I guess that tree must have looked at me, and I also had that sort of feeling when I was cutting this tree down. Does the tree realize that I'm sort of imbuing qualities to this tree that probably don't exist, because I'm not a tree hugger, and I don't believe the trees really have emotional responses or in intelligence in that sort of sense. But while I was cutting it, I was thinking, well, does this tree realize that I'm actually doing this for the tree's own good, and ultimately benefiting the tree, so that the tree can actually concentrate some of its effort in terms of some of these nutrients into producing fruit, because this tree's obviously forgotten what its God-given purpose was in life, and that was to produce fruit. I suppose if this tree could have thought for itself, it would have probably imagined itself to be the most glorious fruit tree in the garden itself, and having lost its purpose, it wouldn't have realized that it wasn't producing fruit. So it reminds me pretty much of what we read in Matthew chapter 6 verses 19 to 21. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So the other thing that I noticed about this tree that I'd cut down, or the branches that I'd cut down, and when I say I'd cut down, or pruned, I'd cut out quite a lot of large branches, was that when I looked at these branches, when they'd sort of fallen to the ground, because I was going to cut them up for firewood, I noticed that a lot of these branches actually were rotten inside. The center had developed some kind of rot. So even though these branches looked thick and strong and sort of supported this magnificent tree, when I say magnificent for a peach tree anyway, but these literally the wood was rotten inside, and it's really the same for us. Often the things that we think give us the most glory in this world, the things that we try to achieve, the things that we feel is bringing glory to us as people, are often driven by a rotten inside, lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. And just in the same way as this was invisible to the naked eye, it was an internal thing. It's often the same with people, that on the surface one develops all these things, I suppose, that bring glory to people in terms of the world, but on internally they're rotten. And we know that God says that he looks at our hearts, not at things on the outside, but he looks what's in our hearts. If we read in Luke 16 verse 15, he said to them, you are the ones when he was talking to the Pharisees, he said, you are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of others, but God knows your hearts. What people value highly is detestable in God's sight. And I suppose in my mind I imbued this tree with intelligence and being able to feel pride and that kind of thing. And I suppose with that would have had to have gone free will. But I suppose a tree doesn't really have that ability to decide to the kind of extent that we're talking about. So I, as the gardener, had to make the decisions here in terms of as far as the tree was concerned, which branches to cut and which branches to leave. Even though these branches were beautiful branches and they were already they were in bud already, because they were preparing for the summer to be able to absorb all that beautiful sunshine and really make the tree look glorious. The tree couldn't see what I could see, and that the tree wasn't producing fruit. It had, as I said, lost sight of that objective. And so I, as the gardener, had to make that decision to cut those branches. And if we in our lives wish to have God as our gardener, we've got to accept that there are going to be times in our lives that God is going to have to cut branches, that God, as the gardener, knows what's good for us and what's going to make us bear good fruit, and which branches are absorbing our nutrients and energy and time in terms of our focus. And so God will cut these branches in our lives, and if we trust that in God and that He's always doing the best for us, then we've got to accept that sometimes when we're going through hard times and times are difficult and things aren't working out, that God is the gardener who knows what what brings the good fruit out in us. And we've got to accept that this is according to God's plan. We read in Romans chapter 8 verse 28, and we know that all things God works for the good of those who love him, and those who have been called according to his purpose. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7 that we'll be recognized by the fruit we bear, and he also says that a good tree produces good fruit and a bad tree produces bad fruit, and that a tree that doesn't produce fruit should be chopped down. And we read in, just to read it in Matthew chapter 7 verses 16 to 20, he says, by their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit, is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus by their fruit you will recognize them. So the peach tree in our garden was really serving no purpose other than serving its own glory in terms of producing these branches and this foliage. And likewise, we too in our lives also sometimes lose our purpose, and we forget what our purpose is, and we start letting things get ahead of our purpose, and things like our careers, wealth, power, all the things that the world looks at and the world judges us by. We start believing that this success is what life is all about, and these are the branches that we start feeding. And the more we feed them, the stronger they grow and the bigger they get, and the more nutrients and effort and time it requires on our side to feed these branches. And obviously the more we're focusing on this, the less time we start to give to God, and eventually there's very little that we can give to God, because we're focusing all our effort on maintaining and feeding these branches that we've grown, and we're no longer bearing fruit. So as we develop all these branches, and the more success that, as the world sees it, that we have, the less we feel dependence on God, and the less we rely on God, and the less we talk to God, and we actually start moving away from God through these things of the world, or these branches that we've grown. And so often the difficulty in life is, for us, is being able to recognize these branches that need to be cut, and these things that are preventing us from producing good fruit. But the other question that comes to mind as well is that how do we produce good fruit, and what is good fruit? If we have a look at it, for example, good works isn't necessarily good fruit, because I don't really want to get into the discussion in this exhortation about faith versus works, but in a nutshell, and no pun intended there, is that good fruit comes from having Jesus in our hearts, and through having Jesus in our hearts and the love of Jesus and God, it's the manifestation of God's glory in our lives. If we allow the Spirit to work in our lives, and the Spirit to produce fruit, we know in Galatians that what the fruits of the Spirit are, and that's a sign or the manifestation of Jesus in our hearts, and really that's what good fruit is about. We read in Galatians chapter 5 verses 22 to 23, but the fruits of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. So it's by having Jesus in our hearts, and it's through this love for Jesus and this love for God that we are able to show this love to other people. And it's important that we manifest this love in all kinds of ways, in terms of the people around us, our family, our friends, our family in Christ, that we show each other love, that we show caringness and kindness and gentleness, and that we manifest what we can of the fruits of the Spirit. But when I say we can, I'm talking about Christ working through us. But it's important that we put all our efforts into manifesting and allowing Jesus to work in our hearts. And by having Jesus as the gardener in our hearts, and trimming and chopping the branches, as I was the gardener for this tree, and I could see what the tree couldn't see, and I knew what branches to cut and which branches to leave. And as I said, even branches that were budding, I had to make that decision and cut those branches. So with Jesus as our gardener in our hearts, he can also cut and trim and allow us to bear good fruit, allow us to manifest God in our lives and God's glory in our lives, and in this way that we can also produce good fruit. But if we didn't have Jesus in our hearts, or we neglected our relationship with Christ and with God, those branches that once bore good fruit would start to grow and grow and grow and become stronger and broader and higher and taller. And eventually those branches that were bearing good fruit would no longer bear good fruit, because, as I said earlier, all our nutrients would be going into feeding these branches. And even if these branches did bear fruit, these branches would be so tall that the fruit wouldn't be able to be reached by anybody, and nobody could enjoy that fruit, and it would be wasted fruit. It would be essentially burnt by the sun and eventually rot and fall from the tree. And the only thing that those fruit would have ever have done was bring glory to the tree itself. So we also read in Matthew 21 verse 43, "Therefore I tell you that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to people who will produce its fruit." So I want to finish off that as we prepare our minds now for the meal that we're going to share with Jesus, as we walk through those trees in the Garden of Gethsemane, so that we can remember Christ and remember his love and the Father's love, that the sacrifice that they made so that we could bear good fruit. I would like to read from John chapter 15 verses 1 to 17. "I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me, as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire and burned. If you remain in me, and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love hath no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friend. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know what his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends, for everything that I have learned from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you, so that you might go and bear fruit, fruit that will last, and so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give to you. This is my command: love each other. Amen.